In this video, I will be presenting our paper, You Spin Me Right Round, Baby Right Round. In this study, we were examining the impact of multisensory self-motion cues on motion sickness during a VR reading task. But why are we interested in reducing motion sickness using VR headsets? We believe that VR and AR will make their way into our cars and other forms of transport in the near future, and passengers will spend long periods of time using these headsets for entertainment or work. But one of the biggest drawbacks for using these devices is the occurrence of motion sickness. Many people get sick when traveling in cars already, and this discomfort is partially caused by a mismatch between physically perceived self-motion and the visually perceived self-motion of the passenger. So when we're reading books or when we're wearing VR headsets, most visual cues giving us information about our self-motion are occluded, and that results in nausea and people feeling very unwell. So introducing other sensory cues that give such information about self-motion can help reduce these adverse symptoms. In the example here, you can see visual cues behind the screen that give the passenger information about how the car is moving. And in our work, we are now interested whether we can use auditory motion cues in combination with visual motion cues or on their own to reduce motion sickness. Visual cues have been shown to be quite successful in reducing motion sickness, but using them also means that large parts of the visual field have to be taken up by these cues. So you can see that in this example, we have 3 displays, but most of the visual field is taken up by these visual motion cues giving us information about our self-motion. If auditory cues on their own are, however, successful in reducing motion sickness, that means that the entire virtual display can be used for the game that is being played or the task that is being performed by the user. And it means that we don't have to use any of the visual space to display this motion cue anymore. In our study, we focus on a productivity task. Passengers often spend their time reading while traveling or working while commuting from and to the workplace. And therefore, in our study, participants performed a reading comprehension task. They had to read short articles and then answer 4 multiple choice questions about the content of the article. While doing this task, they were asked to constantly rate the level of motion sickness using the slider that you can see here that's placed below the reading task. So in the picture here, you can see an example of a reading passage and an example of a question. Here you can see an example of a visual motion or vection cue. Participants were performing the reading task while they were being rotated to the left or right on the chair, and the visual background is giving them the same information about their self-motion as they are perceiving physically. Here's an example of the auditory motion cue. We placed 3 sound sources in a virtual environment that corresponded to places in the environment. These spatial auditory cues were placed around the participant, providing information about their self-motion. You can hear a church bell that was placed on a church in the scene, bird noises which were placed in the park, and construction noises which were placed on the construction site in the scene. If you're wearing headphones, you should be able to perceive the stereo audio and perceive an auditory self-motion cue. In the following, I will quickly present our 5 conditions. Again, to fully perceive the stereo audio cues, I would recommend wearing headphones. We started our experiment with our baseline condition. In this condition, the chair was not rotating, so participants should not experiencing any motion sickness, as there was no conflict between the visual, auditory, and vestibular motion signals. Condition was our auditory condition. In this condition, the chair was rotating and there were spatial auditory vection or motion cues giving the participant information about their self-motion, but no visual vection cues were presented, meaning there was a conflict between the visual and vestibular motion cues. Condition was our visual stimuli condition. Again, the chair was rotating, so there were physical rotations, and we now had visual vection cues giving the participant information about their self-motion, but no auditory vection cues, meaning there was a conflict between the auditory and vestibular motion cues. We are now combining auditory and visual vection cues. Again, we have physical rotation of the chair and we have visual vection cues as well as spatial auditory vection cues, meaning there shouldn't be any conflicts between auditory, visual, and vestibular motion. condition, there were neither visual nor auditory vection cues. So the chair was rotating, but participants got no information about their self-motion from visual or auditory cues, meaning there was a conflict between auditory, visual, and vestibular motion. So what did we find? As expected, visual self-motion cues were successful in reducing motion sickness on their own, and adding auditory cues to the visual cues further improved the experience of the users. However, auditory self-motion cues on their own were not successful in reducing motion sickness. We know that auditory motion cues induce a weaker sensation of self-motion compared to visual motion cues, and they could therefore not have been strong enough to mitigate the motion sickness in this experiment, as it was quite sickness-inducing. Or the conflict between the perceived visual self-motion and the physical self-motion might have overshadowed any beneficial effects of our auditory cues. We were interested whether the addition of our visual and auditory motion cues might distract participants from their task. However, we found the opposite. Visual motion cues actually reduced perceived mental demand, and the combination of visual and auditory cues resulted in the lowest frustration scores and was perceived as the least physically demanding, suggesting that visual and auditory vection cues do not distract users from performing productivity tasks in VR. So in conclusion, our findings highlight that combining multiple sensory motion cues can improve the overall experience of users in VR and can reduce motion sickness symptoms, suggesting that including such vection cues can allow passengers to engage in productivity tasks while traveling using VR devices, demonstrating that the addition of these cues does not negatively affect workload or performance on tasks while strongly reducing motion sickness symptoms. If you have any more questions, please have a look at our paper or come find me at Kai